I just wanted to ask some questions at the end of the day that were, I think, relevant to a lot of things that you've heard. For those of you who are interested, I've been doing a lot of stuff in this space for the last 8 years and following it and experimenting it with the magnet, which I got yesterday, with other stuff. And I think there are some questions that I think I haven't been able to answer today, and I think that are still relevant. So who of you is going to do some biohacking when you get home? Raise your hands. Some kind. Whatever you think biohacking is, you're going to try something at home, whether it's an app. Who of you is going to do something for somebody else? So who's going to build something or do something that will help somebody else instead of yourself? Okay, so I thought of a couple of things that are relevant in this community, and it's great to work on a lot of stuff that we are all interested in, but who would consider themselves an unhealthy person? Unhealthy, that's only a few. Who of you suffers from depression? Ooh, that's a tricky question, whoever dares to raise their hand. Well, that's one of my feedbacks for the community, and been following it along and going around the world of luckily being able to speak to a lot of people about the subject, that a lot of things we're solving are great for the people who don't need them. That's what we've been working on most of the time, which I love because I think that's where it starts. It will be a hard sell, but there's some issues to consider, and I'll briefly show some examples. So I started out thinking about hospitals, and I started to be more interested in what people are doing. So what people are doing, it's done by 40,000 people in QS meetups around the world, where I'm hosting Amsterdam. I co-founded the European chapter, and people are going around the world and talking about and showing what they actually did. So now I'll ask you, who of you knows any persons in this picture? And actually some of the persons in this picture has actually been shown on the screen before. If you look right, this guy, that's Tim Ferriss, the guy that wrote The 4-Hour Chef and The 4-Hour Workweek. It's actually the living room of Kevin Kelly, and some of you might know Kevin Kelly because his name comes up as the managing editor of Wired. He did that for a while, and he was the first to host some kind of meetup, somewhat similar to the meetups you may have been to or that is here. What can we do with all the data that people are gathering? So they discussed that, they were in his living room, a guy came in the room too late and he said like, okay, you're the first, you tell a story about your data. And he said, that's perfect, because I can exactly explain why I'm late, I can exactly explain how long it took me to get here, why I was running late, and what the route is that I took, and so on. And they coined the term quantified self. That term didn't exist, but it had been going on for 20, 30 years. People were gathering data and then sharing that data. So one of the people that was in front there is actually a guy called Seth Roberts, and Seth has an interesting blog. He unfortunately died way too young, quite recently. And there's a blog post here that actually started, I'm not sure if my internet is connected here. There's an actually interesting experiment, which I cannot show now because I have to do then some filling, but the arithmetic and butter experiment. Who of you heard of the arithmetic and butter experiment? Some people do. Who of you drank some of the upgraded coffee that Timu and Warrior Coffee were supplying today? Some of you. So there's butter in there, right? There's no butter? There's in the bulletproof coffee, or some of you gave me some of the upgraded one with butter. Okay, so there's some people who put butter in that specific coffee. And the reason why is actually because some people have done research and experiments towards the effects of butter on your brain function. And Seth actually started that. He said the best way really to get that started is to start doing things and to start experimenting. He was a guy that he was an emeritus professor of experimental psychology. He would stand on one leg and then he would try to see what the effect was on his sleep the next night. And his colleagues would ridicule a little bit of what he was doing, and they would say, that's not real science. And the problem is, how can we connect the real science, what people call the real science, with what we are all doing, which is basically N of 1. We're all doing things for ourselves. And that is something that's being worked on. And maybe we can, are you logging in? Okay, that's good. What's being worked on is, who of you is a medical professional? Few of you, right? Okay, so the randomized controlled trials, the big experiments in the medical field, they don't take into account a lot of the data we're amassing here. So we have, SQS, sponsored a project or worked on a project called Personal Data for Public Good. And it's actually a project where we are actively working on having randomized controlled trials or big studies in the future, but with all of your personal data. So not with the general data, not with the data that we think is generally applicable. So 1 second back, this is the experiment that Seth did. And how it worked was actually funny, because that's what's been going on for years now. People started commenting on his blog. So he said, I did some experiments with butter, I did some experiments without the butter. And then people said, oh, well, that's interesting, what's going on? So they went to the comments and they start commenting. So there's some people who have some theories about vitamins or about certain things that are going on in your brain function. And they started commenting on that. So what he said was basically the important point from his discussion is do the smallest thing possible. And what I did is, and what I can recommend to everybody, is start with something not because you have a wearable or a gadget, but start with something that you try to find your question, not to find the answer. Try to find what is really bugging you. And what was really bugging me at one point was I was in a meeting, and 15 minutes into the meeting I had to go to the toilet. I was like, that's annoying, and that's not once, that's often before a meeting, and I can't figure out if it's the coffee that I drank, if it's the water that I drank, and I'm not even, until the moment I need to go to the toilet, already aware of what I want to do or that I need to go. So I took this app. Who of you has used the app called Logsit? If you haven't, it's the most basic app because there's no content in there. There's only suggestions for questions you can ask. It's a package you can do around health, or you can do productivity questions, but it's basically helping you make you more aware of the questions you can ask. It made me more aware of how often I went to the toilet, when it happened. But what helped me the most was I did an action that was making me do something when in this case, when I needed to go to the toilet was coming up. So I had to press a button, I had to do something. And that physical feedback loop, I had to do something when that happened. I realized when it was happening, and I started, for example, putting reminders in my calendars right before my meetings. Check 3 things, like do you need to go to the toilet, do you have the notes, do you have the other things? That was my question, and I could have bought a ton of wearables, but it didn't answer any of my questions. So the relevance is a real big thing where people sort of go past. They'll try a wearable, and they chuck it in the cupboard after 3 weeks. And sometimes, some people say it's a bad thing, that it's only being used for a very short period of time. But also think about what you normally do is you have some kind of treatment or some kind of thing you want to solve, and there is a point that the problem is solved. So what's the bad case if your wearable ends up in the closet after 3 weeks, if you have solved your problem? It's not necessarily a bad thing not to be continuously measuring. But you can use the data very well. The Dutch startup Braber is actually doing that. They're using your data when you sleep and how you sleep for employees who do a lot of infrequent work schedules, traveling, shift work, and so on. And they're using that data to say, this is the moment in the day you can make the best decision. So the mental resilience, when are your abilities to make decisions the best, they're putting it actually into an app for them. I'll skip some slides, but this is one that I find, because that's what I wanted to open a little bit of the discussion with, was what are the most important things that people are working on, or what are the things that people are working on and the things that are most important? This is something actually that was thought up by Alexandra Crane from ELISA, a US foundation. It's called the ostrich index. So you know what ostriches do when they don't want to know about something, they put their head in the sand. This index shows that it's basically the importance of a subject divided by how much the issue is addressed. So getting enough exercise, it's an important issue for some, but it's being addressed everywhere. All the people that are working on stuff are doing things for getting more exercise. On the whole other end, so there's diet issues, but the big issues you see on the right, what people are struggling with, are things like job stress, caregiver stress, relationships, unhealthy sex life, money concerns. Who of the things and the things that we've been talking about is really trying to figure that out in a way that it helps actually alleviate? Because try to get somebody to exercise if they have no money, and if they're constantly worried about whether they can pay the bill. They'll probably be more interested if you can help them with that problem than with the other problem. So my question is really, what is the what are some of the things maybe that you think that are important to be worked on that we haven't heard about today? And I think Mikko has a catch box, but I'm trying to figure out where he left it. So maybe you can throw it. Maybe somebody has a suggestion for something that we didn't talk about today that should be talked about. Maybe something that you said, hey, we need to also talk some more about this kind of topic. Anybody? Yes.
Hey there. So there was some talk today about empathy in the workplace, and also one touch on actionable data. And is there any kind of effort being taken where the quantitative, the collection of data is being done so in a social context, so that there's actionable things like, let's say we all monitor our exercise level. If a group of that, a subgroup of that group is not exercising enough, maybe an event is coordinated for those people so they can support each other. I mean, is there any actual N of X, right?
Right, it's a very good question. So the question that, the social context is very important is actually being supported by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a project called, if you go on Twitter and search for the hashtag culture of health, what they're actually doing is trying to find all the factors around what influences the health of people that is not necessarily physiological. So the heart rates and the stress levels, they all come from something. There's another movement which is called the upstreamists, I have to call it right, which are people that are for mostly social health workers that go and look upstream. So there's this famous tale of the kids thrown into water. Maybe some of you heard it. There's kids thrown into the water and somebody sees the kids, struggling, and he jumps in and he finds out and he wants to rescue the kids, and somebody says that's not fast enough or that's not effective enough. And there were 3 friends, so the second friend starts building a raft and he starts pedaling towards the kids and try to save them. And the third friend actually goes away and they're calling him out. They're saying, what are you doing? The kids are drowning. And he says, I'm going to find out who's throwing the kids in the water. And so that's what we need to do sometimes more of. It's trying to find out whether your housing situation, like air quality was named today, is affecting how well you're feeling. So the Culture of Health, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and some other project, there's a good stress report also published by RWF, is trying to research the social context of health.
I think we still have time for one more final question before we wrap up the event and move on to the after party. So if there's some final thing for Maarten, now it's the perfect time to ask, and it seems that there is. So it's going to be a long throw.
So, should I now introduce myself? Oh.
Yeah, you can talk into the cube, I think. Yes.
Awesome. I work as a personal trainer, and then I work as a designer, as a service designer. So I have 2 kind of like hats. I think the next phase should be where we do services and not focus on the stuff, on the wearables and the stuff that goes into you or comes out of you or whatever. Because I think most of the people don't understand, whereas my personal training clients come into play, they don't understand the data. They need one person to make sense of it. So there comes me, whereas I don't want to be unemployed, but I do want them to be self-efficient. So where do you see this coming up? Is it within 1 year, within 5 years, within 10 years?
I think it's a very good question. The question of who is actually making sense of all the data, because what we not should mistake for is that most of the people in the room are probably higher trained than average people that have to interpret, that have most of the, for example, money concerns or the unhealthy lifestyles, other things. To help them with that, need some mediation from a personal trainer. Some people call them quant coaches nowadays that help you interpret the data. That's happening already nowadays. And what I think that we also need to realize is there's a lot of people already in our system that are doing a lot of good work. Doctors, we can help them, give them the tools, but also the ways of interacting with the data that can help the people. Or they can hire, which some doctors I know do, an assistant specifically focused on interpreting the data that helps them with their day-to-day jobs. So they prepare basically all the data. When the doctor goes and talks to the patient, he has a very brief overview of the highlights. And it's coming more and more where we fuse some of the activities you can automate, the algorithms that are preparing the data, with the efforts of, for example, a person summarizing some of the highlights or a person giving some interpretation because they know the person personally. And so it's progressing from there, both inside, like you said, and outside with personal trainers that are setting up their own business, because you don't necessarily need to be in that system. Okay?